The new rankings are out. Should you care? Should you not care? What are the changes? How should we think about rankings in general? I am so excited that today we have Mike Spivey here with us. And I think most of you know who Mike Spivey is. But in case you don't know who Mike Spivey is, Mike Spivey is the founder of Spivey Consulting, and he draws upon extensive experience. I think, very few people have been in the law school admission game as long as Mike Spivey. He's had administrative roles at prestigious schools like Vanderbilt University, Washington University in St. Louis, and the University of Colorado. He has received national recognition for not just the work that he has done in law school admissions and, of course, with Spivey Consulting, but also as a leading person that speaks about mental health, wellness, mindset. We're so happy to have these conversations with Mike Spivey. He's been featured in leading media outlets and prestigious publications like the Chronicle of Higher Education, and he's honored as an inductee of the Blackburn Society for his ethical leadership. So, Mike, we are just really happy to have you here. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I can guarantee you some people haven't heard of me, but I'm very appreciative of you having me on.
Let's talk about the rankings. And you guys at Spivey Consulting, you guys are all over the rankings. You even got the rankings a little bit early. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I've gotten the rankings early for almost every year the last, whatever, 25 years. Schools get an embargo copy. There's two reasons why. One is if they get a copy and there's misinformation, they get to do US News's work for them. So in an ideal world, US News would spot check errors, but what they do is they send it to schools and have schools do the accounting for them. The second reason, presumably, is if you give schools an embargoed version of the rankings, the dean can prepare a statement or whatever. So what has happened for almost every year of the last many years is multiple schools, while they can't share them publicly, they can share them to me, and then I'm allowed to share them publicly. I'm not under the embargo. So that's how we got the copy and shared the copy early.
Why is that important for schools to give you the rankings early? Like, why is it important for you to share the rankings early? Talk to me a little bit about maybe your firm's relationship with rankings and with law schools also in particular.
I honestly don't. We have relationships with, as I just mentioned to you, I've talked to, 50 or 60 schools this week. We have relationships with tons of schools. Some we help, some read our blog and look at our data. I think a lot want us to see the data ASAP. As we mentioned on our blog, last year, US News released their own leak per se. It's not a leak if it comes from them. But last year, US News put up the top 14 and got their own rankings wrong. So I think, and again, I can't really speak for schools, but I think one reason for us to have it would be to hold it accountable. If we put it up and it changes, if you notice on Paul Karen's tax professor law blog, some schools got a version that changed that had 80 schools differently ranked than it did
Wow.
from first. Right. So I
Wow.
think what schools are doing is they're saying, well, let's give this to a third party and have some other eyes on it in case funny things happen over the week embargo period, which funny things did happen. So kudos to those schools.
Every year, it seemed like for the last maybe 3 years, the rankings have changed significantly. Like, I remember there was a time when like the rankings would move a little bit and you'd be like, oh, okay, sure, new rankings. But now, we've had new methodologies several times, and it seems like they're a little bit all over the place. What is your take?
Yeah, I mean, look, rankings have to change or US News doesn't sell subscriptions.
Yeah, facts.
So every year they introduce either new weights or new metrics or both, and usually it's both. Last year they were particularly all over the place because for the first time ever they couldn't they were kind of forced in a box.
Yeah.
Schools have boycotted before. I think a lot of people don't know that, but it's usually been one or two that don't submit data. And US News had a formula so that they would invent the data for those one or two schools based on the average of all schools. But if
Wow.
Yale and Harvard don't submit their data, and US News is taking their formula with averages, and Yale goes from 1 to 28,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
all their previous.
No one is going to listen to that.
That's exactly right. So when 63 schools, including many in the top 20, stop submitting the private, non sort of accountable data, It
Mm.
was never audited. It was never third party audited. When 63 schools stopped submitting that data, US News had to only rely on publicly available data from 509s, et cetera, and their surveys, their own surveys.
Right.
So that produced a good deal of volatility because they weren't prepared for that. What they did this year, interestingly, is they want changes, but they don't like hot. If a school goes up 60 or down 60, that looks really bad on US News because the school
Yeah.
didn't magically get 60 better overnight.
Yeah.
So what US News appears to have done is introduced metrics that took that high degree of volatility and shrunk it some. And that's what we see in the changed metrics is they've gone to some multi-year averages, which won't come as a surprise to you. When you use multi-year averages, it decreases the volatility of the rankings.
But there are some schools I was on, I think it was on Facebook the other day. I'm still afraid of Reddit, but I'll go on Facebook. And,
This will
and
probably end up on Reddit.
yeah.
I don't know what to tell you.
I saw this Facebook post that someone made, and it was like a snapshot of the schools that had the largest ranking changes, right? And there are some schools, I think one school moved 37 points, but there are a handful of schools that moved 14, 17 points. What do you think about that kind of jump?
Well, I think it's better than if they had used the same formula as last year, where you would have schools moving, multiple schools moving 40, 40, 40 places.
Yeah.
What do I think about a school moving 14 or what did you say, 37?
37 was the largest jump that I saw.
So a jump. So do I
Or it
think
was
that's
I think it was a fall. They fell 37 points.
okay? Do I think that school is 37 ranks worse than it was the day before the rankings? Of course not. I think rankings makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. So we get so much information, millions of points of pixels and light and data every second. I think it makes sense that people want something to be ordinally ranked for us
Yeah.
so that we cut out all that information. But do I think that those rankings match with reality? Of course not. I mean, of course that school isn't 37
No.
worse than right. So I think that's silly. And former Dean Donald Tobin, I think he was in Maryland, and I think I got his name right, wrote a nice long article called like the silliness of the rankings where he touched upon that point.
Mm, mm. I think one of the hardest things that we have here at Barrier Breakers is that we, primarily work with first gen minority and immigrant law school applicants. And so there's always this hate love relationship with rankings, in that in a perfect world, it would be nice to say, listen, the rankings don't really matter, take them with a grain of salt. And for the most part, the rankings don't really matter and take them with a grain of salt. But then there is that like secondary issue of, in a world in which there is bias in hiring, where there is barriers to entry for people of color in the legal profession, and those markers of credibility, those markers of prestige, which aren't always correlated to the rankings, but those markers of prestige do matter in terms of hiring and in terms of getting a seat at the table, whether they should or shouldn't. They do in a lot of cases. um, how do we go about helping those students as they're thinking about these rankings? Like I said, rankings don't really correlate to prestige, but there are a lot of students that we work with who feel like, I need to go to a certain ranked school because I need that prestige to help overcome some of this bias that is inherent in the legal profession hiring.
Yeah, I think they do actually. I think rankings do correlate pretty strongly with prestige. But what I would say is, to your point, fluctuations do
Hmm.
not. So does a hiring partner know that UVA went up four? No. They don't have time. They're dealing with their clients on a 24/7 basis. So they don't know UVA. But do hiring partners think of, so to your point, yeah, that fluctuation does not correlate with prestige. But do they know UVA is a perennially top 10 law school? Highly likely, yes.
Right.
So there is a lot of tension between, okay, rankings are not only inexact, but how can the same guy who's been doing them for 32 years, who probably can't name a single 1L class, who is he to tell you what your preferred school is? That's absurd. But yet we do need a compass.
Yeah.
And I think so. The way I think of it is rankings at best are this very starting point compass, not telling us what schools to go to, but maybe helping us direct what schools we might want to consider applying to. Now, that information is still out there, Cindy, but it's nice to have it out there ordered fashion versus having to go to 509s and law school of transparency and our blog and your blog and find it all disparately.
Yeah.
So I think as a compass, it's very helpful at the very beginning, but that's all.
No, I would agree with that. And I think to your point, I think I was mostly thinking about the fluctuations, right? I think about Harvard, which, is now what, fourth, fifth, tied for fourth, something like that. Yeah, I don't think that Harvard is any less prestigious than it was. But first off, it's never actually been first. But I I think if you were to poll people, I don't know how many people know that, but it's
Right.
it's not less prestigious than it was when it was third, or
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 second.
second, right?
Right.
But so that kind of fluctuation, I was like, I don't think that really matters. Like, I think if you take a school, there are some state schools that are fantastic schools, right? Public schools that are fantastic schools that are significantly higher in the ranking now than they used to be, which I think on average is actually a good thing. I don't know if I would say that hiring managers also know that public school that you probably wouldn't think of, especially the ones that are not on the East Coast, is that high in the rankings, right? That those fluctuations, I don't know, really get themselves into like the everyday minds of hiring managers.
I think alums notice, particularly of the school, UF, University of Florida, would be a great case study. They went from 49 to 2021 over multiple years.
Mm-hmm.
In year one, that progress, if you want to call moving up in the rankings progress, I probably wouldn't. That progress probably wasn't noticed. In year two, maybe applicants started noticing and alums started getting excited, but we're still not at the hiring level. But if
Right.
you move up, like Texas A&M is another great example. If you move up for over a sustained,
Consistently.
and then it starts over time, not only impacting hiring, but also that peer assessment where judges and lawyers,
Yeah.
they start finally noticing if it's a long-term trend.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And listen, I will also say, for undergrad rankings, Princeton's been number one for I think 9 or 10 years, and I know, and we care deeply about that number.
Yeah, no,
I wear my orange.
I applied to Princeton as an undergrad, and I mentioned this on another podcast. This was my system because back then we didn't like think much about rankings. So my system was like I applied to Vanderbilt because my aunt had worked there, so I'd seen it a number of times. It was my
Yeah,
number one choice. Then I applied to schools that recruited me in sports. Then I applied to the schools my girlfriend and I applied to. It's just
sounds
my high
fair.
school girlfriend. And
Yep.
then I finally found a copy of You Knew This News, and I said I'm going to apply to the number one school, so I applied to Princeton.
I love that. I love that so much. I too added a school that my then high school boyfriend wanted me to apply to.
That's
So
yeah,
be
it's
careful
a
who
cute.
you date, and
I think it's cute. I think it's cute that you did it. I think it's cute that we did it. It's just
yeah,
something about being young.
yeah. We had this like this. Oh my god, I'm gonna be with you forever.
Right. Right.
So let's get into a little bit of some of the methodology, because I know that there was a lot of discussion in previous years about the use of diversity, and diversity metrics in rankings, and of course the word diversity has become so politicized, so charged in ways that it really wasn't a few years ago. Where does that factor into the rankings now?
It doesn't. It's not a metric. So diversity is not a metric. There are separate rankings that rank schools by diversity. It gets a little problematic. I think the public should be 100% aware of how diverse schools are, of course. I think the more diverse a school is, I mean, I have so much experience with this because I've worked for so many years in law schools. At I've taught business ethics. The more homogenetic a class is, the less learning that occurs. The more heterogenetic a class is, the more diverse, the more learning occurs. You want people from different backgrounds. So I think there should be a ranking of schools based on diversity. We've yet to see any inclination that U.S. News is going to throw it into their formula for what it's worth.
And I feel like it gets even harder with some states. I mean, you look at Florida, you look at Texas. Um, they're not going in the direction that we'd like them to go in, and when in terms of diversity, right, and DEI and their feelings on that. And so I think it might get even more difficult for students to get some of that information. If there are other states that follow suit and kind of have this stance towards DEI.
Yeah, it gets so complicated. Of course, I think you're alluding to many things, but also the fact that the UF system and the Texas system abolished or got rid of their their entire DEI staffs,
Yeah,
or in the none of that happens overnight. The
sure.
process doesn't happen immediately. I think another perspective to add would be diversity is self-reported. So if it were part of the rankings, and it became prominent in the
Right,
rankings, would students realize? Would Because I've seen this. I've been on the admission side where someone has clicked, Black African American on their application, and then they show up and there's no reason to believe that they weren't lying. They don't go to any balsa organization events,
right.
and you're just left scratching your head, but you can't undo their application. So
Sure.
it's problematic on many ends.
Right, right. And of course now, schools can't see that race information
That's right.
in admissions, right? So they don't have that. They can still self-report it after the fact. That data is still collected. It's just shielded from admissions. But I do see your point about it being problematic because there's no. I mean, it's sad to say this, but like there's no checks on that data, right? It's not
Correct. And
necessarily accurate.
schools can't ask it in admissions, but the SCOTUS decision was a little more limited than we thought was coming, which is
Right.
good.
Yeah.
The schools themselves, I believe, and it might be through iPads, but the schools themselves probably do have information after
After the
the
fact, yeah, they do.
right. So that could still be a factor in rankings, but because of reason we discussed, I just don't see it coming down the U.S. news pipeline.
So how, like, I mean, you advise students, we advise students, other than, again, taking it with a grain of salt, are there meaningful ways of using the rankings or the change in rankings if they had one list and you know, the list looks different now based on the
Right.
rankings? What are you kind of saying, or what is your firm saying to
Yeah.
students?
Yeah, the best thing you can really do as an applicant is not worry so much about the rankings themselves. You've already applied and you probably use the rankings in that process. You don't want to use the rankings as where you ultimately go,
Sure.
because again, that's some one random dude who's been doing this for 32 years telling you what you like. Why
Right.
would you ever? Right. So the best thing you can do is, as an applicant at this stage, if you're not applying next cycle, at this stage, if you've already applied, is get the rankings out of your head. These
Right. Right.
fluctuations are ridiculous. They're arbitrary. They're based on the need for U.S. news to change the rankings enough so that things change and people subscribe, but
Right.
don't change them too much so that people invalidate the former rankings. So what you want to look at is what is important to you. Is employability important to you? Probably. Is bar passage? Very probably. But someone asked me earlier today on a podcast, what would I look at? I would look 0% at LSAT and GPA, because I don't care what the person next to me has.
Right.
I don't care if they have a 150 or a 180. I literally don't.
It doesn't affect you
It doesn't impact me. But
at all.
for someone else, it might. So, pick your own
Yeah.
what matters, and all that data is available. It's available in 509s, but even more important, talk to people at the school. If you can afford it, and admitted students often get free travel vouchers, go visit the school. Don't talk to the people the admissions office puts in your face, because they're going to take the happiest people. I used to do that,
Yeah.
right? Right. For our mock class and admitted students day, we had the coolest professor, Chris Brummer, who used to work for the CIA.
Yeah.
So of course, are all your law professors going to have worked for the CIA?
No.
No, we put our best foot forward. So ideally, visit if you can. Visit on a random day. Talk to people in the hallway. Believe it or not, Cindy, I'm an introvert by nature. I make myself an extrovert for professional reasons.
Yeah, that's
So
fair.
similarly, if you're an applicant, make yourself an extrovert. Talk to a few people, gather some information, and then you can go back to
Being an
living your
introvert.
life. Exactly.
We have a lot of missions and goals here at Barrier Breakers because I am relentless about trying to change just the way that the legal field looks. And I think for me, one of the things that's so important is hiring, right? And is employability. So we have our annual Break into Law conference, which is coming again this summer. And at our Break into Law conference, which is free, by the way, free to everyone, we always have a law school fair, but we have a career fair on the second day. This year will be the third day because we've expanded into 3 days. And one of my big hopes, maybe, pie in the sky dream, is that we can use these events to get big law firms to look outside of the schools that they typically look for in terms of recruiting students and look at fantastic candidates who might just happen to go to lower ranked law schools for a wide variety of reasons. And for us, we work with a lot of non traditional students, right? And so we have military veterans, we have moms. And because of that, actually going back to the moms, right? Like we have a lot of people who are like, hey, my kids like their school. So I'm applying to law schools so that we don't have to move. So this is my area. And, that might include some well ranked law schools that might not. But they end up going to law school. They end up being fantastic students, some of them, right? And having those top scores. But it's still hard then for employers of certain tier firms to really look at their resume. And so that's one of the things that behavioral changes we're trying to make here at this conference is, hey, let me create opportunities for you to meet candidates that wouldn't necessarily fall in your radar. How do we try, or is it possible, to try to get firms to not put so much weight on, call it prestige, call it rankings, but to look outside of where they
Sure.
normally would?
Yeah, I think to begin with, I think you're doing a great service and inviting firms there to talk to people from with all backgrounds, all kinds of LSAT scores. I'm going to tell you a beautiful story.
Yeah.
I can use names. I've been given permission. So my last admit off the wait list in the early 2000s, maybe 2003, 2004, was a guy named Justin Ishbia with a 152 LSAT. Our median was probably 17 higher than that,
Okay.
or maybe 15 higher.
Yeah.
So this is the last person off the wait list with a 152. So LSAT factors into the rankings, and if LSAT correlated with outcomes as far as your life, the 152 relative to our median of a 165, 167 would have predicted Justin's struggle in his career if that were the case. This is why I tell the story, Sydney. Yesterday, Justin was on the cover of Forbes magazine.
Amazing.
The title was something like "The Billionaire Next Door."
Wow.
So he's a billionaire.
Wow.
And he is a billionaire of the people. Like he like is a normal grounded guy. I haven't had time to read the story. I did text with him. So this is
Just
a
a
cool.
regular next door billionaire.
I think that was kind of this. I haven't read the story, but that was kind of like the theme of the story, I believe.
Let me find out my
So
neighbor is a billionaire.
yeah. I don't think there's that many running around. But the point being, like things that go into the rankings have no like effect on your career,
Yeah.
and firms should know that too. Like I would love to tell as many firms I can this story. With if we hadn't admitted Justin, he may have gone to a top 50 or 100 school and not had the opportunity. Where did he first work? It was Chicago. It was a big law in Chicago. He would Kirkland, I believe. He wouldn't have had the opportunity to work at Kirkland, but that's ridiculous.
Right. Right. And
Because
I agree.
he's a hardworking guy, right?
And honestly, some of our students that end up going to lower ranked law schools, if you will, who end up still succeeding, like they work significantly harder and they are better suited for the demands of the law than some of our other students who might just be really good at taking tests, and are lovely people, but don't always have the same work ethic.
Right.
I love working with non-traditional students because they're hungry, because they've experienced life, and they know how life can life, and this is like their shot, their second chance, it's an opportunity that they're not taking for granted. It's not just like do I don't know what to do with my life, I guess I'll go to law school. It's like, no, I've done some things, I have kids, I have this, I have that, and I am sacrificing a lot because I want this so badly. And those
Yeah.
people make phenomenal lawyers, and all law firms should want those people. And I'm on my soapbox, but it frustrates me when they don't get the opportunity because of the perceived prestigiousness or lack thereof of the law school
Yeah.
that they went to.
It's a great soapbox to be on. What I would say is the LSAT and the GPA have been nearly eviscerated. I don't think people realize how meaningless they are in the rankings.
Mm.
And over time, admissions deans are going to realize that, and they're going to be able to take more people below both medians who they see are working with kids who have grit. So I think it doesn't happen overnight because
Yeah.
change is slow, and most deans of admissions are lawyers, and lawyers are paranoid. So they say, "Well, I see the metric is not that important, but what if?
Yeah.
What if I my median goes down too, and our law school isn't ranked 15? But after a couple of years, I think you're going to see a lot of change on that end and change for the better.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so. I really do because I think that's what we need. I mean, there's no reason why the percentage of black lawyers in this country has basically been at a plateau, right? And even if you look at LGBTQ statistics and you look at, I mean, like across the board, right? Like we're
Right.
not seeing these huge increases despite seeing pretty significant changes in our population as a country. Um, so I'm excited personally for the time when rankings can either help us move towards having a more representative legal space or they just fall less, more out of favor, less importance in the hiring process.
There's a little early evidence that they are falling, that this year people aren't paying as much attention as in previous years. So that's
Okay.
also good news, right?
Tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, so a couple things, but Kaplan did a survey of admissions deans. 51% said they thought rankings had lost their appeal.
Wow.
Only 18% said the following: they haven't lost their luster or shine. Now, keep in mind that doesn't mean that they've gone up.
Right, right.
Only 18% are saying they might be the same.
Just a shiny.
Right, and then the difference is people who didn't respond or didn't comment. So 51 saying they've gone down versus 18% that might be just signaling that they think they're still the same. That's pretty significant data. The date, so we leaked the top 25 this year. We didn't for 2 years, but we have in the past. And our own analytics would show that people don't seem to be as interested. We didn't get this huge spike, which is good. The message board that you won't go on to, Reddit, now more than ever before, when someone says, "Should I go to this school that dropped from 36 to 41?" almost all the comments are, "Don't worry about that 5 point drop. Who cares? Like, look at their employment outcomes." So the market is showing more than ever. The applicants are showing more than ever, much more like, "Hey, don't worry about the rankings." It was a huge vector when I started my career. Like, number one was rankings. Number two was like scholarship, merit aid, and number three was location. Now, as a vector, I would say number one is probably employment,
Yeah.
and maybe tied with debt load, and then location. But I doubt rankings are in the top three anymore.
Like I said, we've talked a lot about them maybe going down and maybe losing most. Or what happens then? Like, what do you foresee? What do you predict happens in the future? Like, does U.S. News try to do more to make them more relevant? Is this just the path that we're on?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question. One of two things will happen. This might just be fatigue from last year's drama, attrition, and they go back to having as much relevance. And U.S. News keeps doing their thing. Or it's a continual year to year plummet in luster. And then what I would suspect happens is US News or someone like Forbes, someone with a lot more money than me, does what I did, which is we have My Rank by Spivey where you can
Yeah.
pick, right. Who's to stop Forbes or Business Weekly or US News, who again has a lot more money, to do the same thing, but just make it look a lot more beautiful and pretty on their computer screen? So I think, and that would, to me, would be much better than a ranking system. If I had to predict,
Yeah.
I'm going to guess that their luster, I think we're evolutionarily programmed to like these things like rankings.
Yeah.
So my best guess is they actually go back up in prominence. But last year I would have said I'm 90% sure that's going to happen or 80% sure. Now I'm only like 55% sure. So I'm 45% on they're in a downswing that's not going to stop.
Now I do want to ask, and it's actually funny to think about that world because I know that Forbes loves their lists, and I can feel like someone's like, wait, this is an idea.
Right. Well, I'm giving away my product to other people. Take it.
But I do want to ask, I don't know how much you know about the undergraduate ranking scene, but it feels very different for the undergrad. First off, there's more schools, right? There's 4,000 colleges in the US, probably a little less with some closing, but thousands of schools in the US. And while there is kind of a list, right, of the best colleges, there are a lot of other lists, right? Best biology programs, best
Right.
astrophysics program,
Right.
all, best. There's so many lists that when I
Right.
talk to, because we do college admissions as well, and when I talk to parents and when I talk to students and counselors, they're not all looking at the same one list, right? They all have the lists that matter to them. Is there ever a world in which law school admissions becomes like that, where it's decentralized from one list, but there are maybe other lists? Maybe it's about clinics or journals or other
Right.
things.
I think the problem, so we've been asking that for 26 years. I say we, I've been in the legal academy for 26 years, and that question's been asked. I think the problem is that more so than almost any profession, the legal profession is hinged on what's called attribute-based esteem. Did my lawyer go to Harvard? Then I will hire that firm as a client. That's called attribute-based esteem. That person has worth because they went to Harvard. So the legal profession, big law, really knows that it's to their benefit
Yeah.
that. So my firm's another example. We have plenty of consultants from Harvard, Yale, Columbia, whatever, but we also have consultants from Lewis and Clark and in schools that aren't elite in the rankings.
Sure.
And a number of times clients will call and say, can you give me the person from a top 10 or 14, not outside the top 50? Is that consultant any worse because weren't? Of course not, obviously.
Absolutely.
So this arena from the, as we just discussed, from all the way from the applicant to the lawyers is very much prestige oriented.
Yeah.
And I think when you're prestige oriented, it creates barriers of entry to a diffuse system where you can't tell, hey, this is number one. Oh, wait, this one says number one.
Right.
So I think that we're in a particularly nearly unique. I don't know if it's unique. There might be medical, might be the same.
Yeah.
I don't know. But we're in a very particularly small sliver where people really want that one-dimensional prestige told to them.
Is there anything else we haven't touched on about the rankings? I mean, you've been so generous with your time and your insights, especially as we think about, like I said, our first gen immigrant, our students of color. Is there anything else that we should touch on when it comes to the rankings?
Well, often what I've noticed, and if I can be so bold to speak from my many years of doing this, one thing I've noticed is depending on the culture of the nation that people are applying from, there's a good number of international students who apply to schools because their parents tell them to.
Sure.
And are their parents experts on what law school is best for them? No, they're just looking at rankings. So since you mentioned, first gen, which oftentimes are international students, immigrants, which, by
Right.
definition, they're coming from another country. To the extent that your audience might fall into that category, look, I understand I'm not from a different culture, although I do come from a culture, America, which also puts a high value on this stuff. I would say that when you're 18, 19, 22, 24, it might seem like an earth-shattering, too tough of a hurdle to jump to say, I'm going to apply to the schools that are best for me, not are best for my parents. But at the end of the day, it's your life you're living, not the life of someone else. I've seen this all the time. Apply to the top six and nothing else.
Mm,
And you have maybe a 150 and a 3.0. Like, please consider other places. You're going to be a good lawyer.
yeah.
Like, I don't want you to go over six because someone dictated to you that you must apply to the top six. It doesn't, not just international, anyone in this country, any
Yeah.
first generation, any diverse applicant. Please don't listen to someone else make you decide what you should apply to. Have some say in it. You have agency.
Yeah, I love that, and we will usually decline to work with students that come in with that mindset, because I feel strongly that I have a duty to do what's best for you as an applicant and to advise you on what's best. And that advice of I'm going to the top, I'm only applying to top six and nowhere else. I can't even in good faith like help you do that because
100%. We've had years where we've turned down 50% of our of the people who reach out to us.
yeah,
Five
yeah,
zero percent. So
that's
because
so
we're
true.
not, if I can turn someone from 40% likely to 51% likely, let's roll. But if they're at 5% likely and they want 51, there's no way. I don't think I've ever seen you do this, but I've seen other consultants tweet things like, just got someone with a 155.39 into Harvard. I never tweet all those success stories because I don't want people with a 155.39 thinking that they're likely to get into Harvard because they're not.
Yeah,
They
yeah, yeah.
can.
Right,
They can
right, right,
certainly
right.
call us and flesh it out, but there's so many factors involved.
I also, like I said, lawyers are risk averse, and that is a risky thing to do. And I would like you to take the path that is less risky, right? Like
Yeah, it
this.
best apply to a range of schools,
Oh,
and
right.
if you want
No,
to be at
balance
Harvard,
this.
for sure, exactly.
This was so helpful. Thank you so much for for being here. Where can people, I mean, I'm sure people know, but where can people find you or and if they want to work with you or work with your firm?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So spiveyconsulting.com. Anyone can LinkedIn. I very much prefer LinkedIn because you can block people. so so Mike Spivey on LinkedIn, Spivey Consult on Twitter. We're now on TikTok. I think you are too. So
We
Spivey
are on
Consulting
TikTok.
on TikTok. Anna Hicks Hako does a bunch of jazzy videos.
Oh, that's
So
exciting.
any of those places, we're all over.
And where is the ranking tool that you have?
Yeah, thank you. My rank by Spivey.com.
My
And it's
rank
free.
by
It's
Spivey.
just like you do. Almost everything we do online is completely free. We don't have like portals where you have to pay access to get into. So it's all free.
Awesome. We will link that both in the show notes. Thank you so much, Mike, for being on here today.